Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close-Up, he's one of the lesser-known Republican presidential candidates. Why Vivek Ramaswamy says Iowa will change that. And former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson formally announces his run for the White House, how he plans to stand out in a growing field of Republicans. In South Carolina, Senator Tim Scott inching closer to his own presidential run. We sit down one-on-one to ask when he'll make his decision.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us and welcome to Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. Last week, several Republican presidential hopefuls and some potential candidates came to Iowa for the Faith and Freedom Coalition spring event in Clive. I sat down one-on-one with three of those Republicans: former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, businessman Vivek Ramaswamy, and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. Now, Scott took a major step earlier this month toward officially hitting the campaign trail, launching a presidential exploratory committee and traveling to early states like Iowa and New Hampshire. I asked Scott when he'll announce whether he's officially running for president and what would set him apart from his Republican opponents. You have officially launched a presidential exploratory committee. As we're looking at the field for 2024 start to shape, what path forward do you see for yourself?
You know, I'm excited that on my Faith in America tour, the one thing I've heard consistently are people are starving for an optimistic, positive message as long as it's anchored in conservatism. They want people to understand the issues that we're fighting for and not the people we're fighting against. And I think it's really important that we do that, have a conversation with the American people about the things that we are working to solve. And honestly, the other thing I'd say is I hear a lot about the radical left and Joe Biden, how their approach to the economy has led to inflation over 16%, making like single mothers like the one that raised me, it's almost impossible to make their ends meet. In the education field, they want someone who will champion the cause of school choice, much like Governor Reynolds has done here in the great state. School choice means that every parent has a choice, which allows their kids to have a chance.
When people seem to be so angry about issues that you brought up, school choice, education, gender issues, abortion, how do you pitch yourself as a positive unity candidate when it seems like people are angry and looking for someone to fight on issues they're frustrated about?
Well, they want people to fight, but they actually want people to win. And that's one of the things I believe that we do really well. We're going to win on the issues that matter most to the American people. We've already had the opportunity to showcase that when we were in the majority, that I had the chance to write the personal side of the tax code that led to most families getting about $4,400 back in their paychecks. We saw unemployment hit the lowest levels for African Americans, Hispanics, a 70-year low for women, historic low for Asians, overall population a 50-year low. What we keep proving is that there is a way for us to win the battles that count the most. And on the cultural side, we are just ready to educate our kids and stop indoctrinating our kids. You have to have someone who wants to defend the principles that matter the most, not just go fight, but go win.
Abortion has been a central issue already in the presidential race. It's likely to continue to be. First, on the Supreme Court ruling that just came down to temporarily protect access to the abortion pill mifepristone, what's your response to that decision?
Well, we have to trust our judiciary. The process continues. We'll see what the Supreme Court ultimately rules, but at this point, I think we have to have confidence in our judiciary.
And overall on abortion, do you see that as a states-only issue?
I think every life has value because it comes from the Lord. I mean, that's where life comes from. I have 100% pro-life voting record. I'm 100% pro-life conservative. I believe that what we have to do is win the hearts and minds of the American people so that we have a chance to have the most conservative pro-life legislation signed into law.
How does that translate at a federal level? If you were president, what would your federal policy be on abortion?
For us to get anything through Congress so that if I were president, I could sign the most conservative piece of legislation, pro-life legislation that comes to my desk, we're going to have to first win the hearts and minds of the American people. Without doing so, we won't have any legislation that comes to my desk. But I would be happy to sign the most conservative pro-life piece of legislation that we can get through Congress.
In your mind, what is that? What is the ideal federal legislation that's the most conservative that you would like to sign?
The most conservative we can convince the American people that we should have passed through Congress. It really is.
National ban, 20 weeks, what is it to you?
Yeah, listen, I've already supported the 20-week pain-capable legislation. I've certainly already stated the fact that I would support a 15-week abortion limit, but we won't get any of it done if we don't convince the American people that, in fact, we need to have an honest conversation about the culture of life and prove to them that we can help that child grow and to be a high-functioning person who realizes their American dream.
How do you win hearts and minds when people seem divided on this?
One of the most important principles of bringing people together who disagree is to learn to disagree without being disagreeable. The fact is that when you have a conversation about the sanctity of life, it should not only be before the child is born, it has to be after the child is born. One of the areas I've tried to focus my attention with other senators like Senator Steve Daines is by providing more resources for the mother who's raising that child. I was a kid raised in a single-parent household and mired in poverty. The one thing that we have to do is to make sure that there are more resources for the child after birth.
One last quick question. When will you make a final decision on whether you're going to run for president?
The good news is as I continue my journey around the country, I keep seeing momentum around our message. We keep seeing more people showing up to have a conversation about it. As long as the message of optimism that is anchored in conservative principles has traction, it makes it easier for me to get to a conclusion sooner than later.
You have a certain month or anything in mind that you have, I'm going to make a decision by, this season or this month?
I will make a decision in this season.
In the spring?
In this season. So stay tuned to the same channel, the same time, and we'll be back.
Still to come on Close Up, a candidate who is officially in the race for president, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, how he says he's different from Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. And a campaign launching pad, why Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy says the Iowa caucus is the perfect place to grow his name recognition. Welcome back to Close Up. KCCI told you earlier this month, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson planned to run for president. Well, last week he made his formal announcement. Hutchinson told the crowd there in Bentonville, Arkansas, he's been a Republican as far back, he says, as when Arkansas was a blue state. And he says his conservative platform helped him first win a seat in Congress and later the governorship. Well, Hutchinson argues that same conservative platform will take him to the White House. I sat down with him during his trip to Iowa and asked him what sets him apart from the other candidates, including frontrunner and former President Donald Trump. Well, you're now officially a Republican presidential candidate, but for Iowans who may not know your background, tell me a little bit about your story, who you are, and how that has shaped your presidential campaign.
Well, thank you, and probably the most important thing about me is that I grew up on a farm, and that was in northwest Arkansas, so My parents were a blue collar, worked in a poultry facility as well as farm. And then through education, I had opportunities in life, but I've been a federal prosecutor. I've served in the United States Congress. I was in the Bush administration, head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And then after the 9/11 attack, I was asked to help protect America, and I was part of Homeland Security. But just as significantly, I had the greatest job in America, which was governor for the last 8 years. And so that's a lot of my public career, which is part of the credentials for running for president. But just as importantly, I have a wonderful family. I've got a wife of 49 years. We're still sweethearts, and she's looking forward to coming to Iowa as well.
What's your hope that Iowans take away from how you may provide a different vision than some of the other Republicans in the race?
You know, you look at what distinguishes you from other candidates, and first of all, I'm a former governor. I've led a state, I've made those decisions, and there's a more narrow field when you look at people with that kind of leadership experience. Secondly, I will have more extensive federal law enforcement experience than anyone in the race, and that's an important issue today, understanding law enforcement and our future. And then the last time we balanced the budget in the United States was when I was in Congress. And so balancing the budget is important to Iowans, it's important to America and our future. So I think that when you look at the Ukraine war, I'm not an isolationist. I believe that America needs to support our allies and our friends and not abandon them. And they're fighting for the cause of freedom. And so we need to continue to support them.
Former President Donald Trump has made calls to strip funding from federal law enforcement, from the FBI. What's your perspective on that? With a lot of Republicans talking about, they argue there's a politicization of federal law enforcement and that there needs to be money taken away from that. Do you agree?
Well, and actually the language they've used is they ought to defund the FBI. I could not disagree more. The FBI has the lead in our counterterrorism efforts. I've worked with them on a whole host of issues. And sure, I agree that we need to straighten out the Justice Department. We don't want to politicize our criminal justice system, but you don't solve that problem by defunding the agency that protects America from terrorism.
Another issue that has become central to this race and will likely continue to be through 2024 is abortion. The Supreme Court recently ruled to temporarily protect access to mifepristone, the abortion pill, nationwide, halting to federal rulings while allowing an appeal to move forward. What's your response to that Supreme Court ruling?
Well, I think there's two major points. First of all, it still leaves to the states the decisions on health care issues such as protecting the unborn and the application of the abortion pill. And then the second part of it is that it seems the FDA will probably be asked to review again the health safety protocols for the use of that abortion pill. And so there's going to be some more discussion on that, but the Supreme Court really wants to get out of that business. They're going to have a hard time doing it because they actually have to review the laws that are passed. But it's up to the states to determine that issue. I'm pro-life. Arkansas has a strong pro-life law, but other states can make different determinations based upon the will of the people, and the abortion pill is just one part of that debate.
So if you were president, would you support federal limits on abortion access, or would you leave that to the states?
Well, first of all, as president, I would believe that the states should determine the issue on abortion. And that's what I've said, that's what I've fought for 30 years, is trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. The states should determine that issue. But if there is some federal jurisdiction, if there's a federal pro-life bill, I've always signed those in the past.
If you were the Republican nominee, how would you contrast yourself to President Biden?
Well, that's really the number one mission. And whenever you look at the failed policies of President Biden, from a lax border security that has allowed fentanyl to come into our communities, when you look at his failed energy policy, I support a pro-growth energy policy in which we're producing again for ourselves and our independence, but also for our allies. Whenever you look at what's happened abroad because of his weakness in coming out of Afghanistan in such a disastrous circumstance, we showed weakness to Russia and to China. We need to be stronger as a country and need to have a stronger presence so that we can lead again and not yield to China. These are major differences with President Biden, but also his administration, day in and day out, pushes a leftist social agenda in our schools and in our businesses, and that has to stop.
Still to come on Close Up, businessman Vivek Ramaswamy is also hoping to win the White House, why he says being a political outsider makes him the strongest candidate. And polls show Florida Governor Ron DeSantis could be Donald Trump's closest competitor if DeSantis chooses to run. How Iowa is playing a major role as he inches closer to a decision. Businessman and Republican Vivek Ramaswamy has been crisscrossing Iowa trying to build up grassroots interest in his run for the White House. I sat down with Ramaswamy to ask about his business background and how that is shaping his campaign.
So I've built my career in business. I've always challenged bureaucracies. I first challenged the bureaucracy of Big Pharma to build a biotech company that developed medicines in areas that pharma had abandoned. That became a multi-billion-dollar business that I led as CEO for 7 years. 5 of the medicines I worked on are FDA-approved products today. But I stepped aside from that to take on what I call the woke industrial complex in America, the politicization of corporate America. So I wrote a book called Woke Inc. that detailed, I think, a lot of that social justice scam, as I call it, in corporate America. And then I started another business called Strive Asset Management to compete with the likes of BlackRock that were foisting these ESG political agendas onto corporate boards. But I realized that it takes 2 to tango. This isn't just a top-down problem. There's a bottom-up cultural problem in our country. And what I see in America today is a national identity crisis where people my age, I'm 37 years old, I'm the first millennial ever to run for president as a Republican, People my age, really any age in this country, if you ask them what it means to be an American today, you get a blank stare in response. And I think that's the black hole at the heart of our national soul. And if we in the conservative movement can answer that question, what it means to be an American today, I think that that's what's going to be the backbone of addressing our economic troubles and addressing some of our foreign policy challenges as well. And that's why I'm in this race.
What platform and what policies you would bring to the White House if you were elected president?
So I'm addressing this revival of national identity in our country. Part of our national identity centers on merit. That's why I'm the first ever presidential candidate to say I would end race-based affirmative action in America. I think that part of our national pride comes from being an economic leader. GDP growth, economic growth is at the top of my agenda. I'd say that many people would, in the Republican Party, talk about spending cuts. Democrats talk about tax increases. I see a better way, which is driving economic growth in this country. That includes abandoning this climate cult that shackles the United States while leaving China untouched. It includes putting people back to work, addressing this epidemic of laziness and even undereducation on skills-based education across the country. I think that's what makes the challenge of addressing China so difficult. I've said as U.S. president, I would actually declare independence, actually have an economic foundation that doesn't depend on our enemy. That's going to involve some sacrifices, but that requires leadership through those sacrifices, and I'm prepared to do that for the country.
How do you do that? What type of policy would that look like to create the type of independence from China that you would like to see?
So some of this is the easy stuff. I think it's holding China accountable for their role in unleashing a global pandemic that's been responsible for millions of deaths. It involves unshackling the U.S. of constraints that we adopt, like emissions caps here, that they don't apply to Chinese oil companies for that matter. But I would go further. I'm prepared as U.S. president to say that we would ban any CCP, Chinese Communist Party affiliate, from buying land here in the United States. That's rampant across the country, an invisible problem that many Americans aren't aware of. I would say that most U.S. businesses should be banned from expanding into the Chinese market unless and until the Chinese government reforms its behaviors.
Another issue that's become central to the presidential race and likely will continue into 2024 is abortion. I want to talk to you a little bit about the recent Supreme Court ruling on mifepristone. What's your thoughts on that Supreme Court ruling temporarily protecting access to that nationwide while the appeal moves forward?
Well, look, I think that this needs to actually be evaluated under the standards of the law. So what the Supreme Court has said is they're going to hear this case and they're going to hear out whether or not the FDA exceeded its authority in granting this special pathway to approval for mifepristone. I think the administrative state, personally, I believe much of the administrative state is unconstitutional. The last bastion of accountability for the administrative state is indeed appeals to the federal court system. So I hope the federal courts, the Supreme Court included, follows the law here, gets to the bottom of what I believe was in excess of FDA's authority, using a pathway to approval that was actually never intended for mifepristone in the first place for life-saving therapies.
But if you were president and you're talking with Republicans in Congress that want to pass a national abortion ban, would you support federal limits to abortion access, or would you tell Congress this is a states-only issue?
So I've been very principled on this issue for a long time. I think Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided. I think Dobbs correctly overturned it because on the basis of the Constitution, the federal government had no business, including federal courts having no business in getting and wading into this issue that was absolutely left to the states. So I think, actually, I'm staunchly pro-life. I do think abortion is a form of murder. But if you believe that abortion is a form of murder, there are no federal murder statutes. That's all left to the states. So I think the constitutionally principled position is that this is an issue for the states at the state level.
And looking at some polling now, Real Clear Politics shows Ramaswamy currently averages in the polls at around 2.3% among Republicans. We'll compare that to former President Donald Trump. It's well behind. Donald Trump's poll numbers average over 50% in a crowded field. Now, Ramaswamy tells me he plans to use a grassroots campaign strategy to boost his name recognition by traveling across Iowa and trying to gain support from Republicans here. Still to come on Close Up, President Biden officially enters the race, and Iowa plays a major role in paving the way forward for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Welcome back to Close Up. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has not officially announced whether he's seeking the presidency, yet polls show he may be Donald Trump's closest competitor. Outside groups like Never Back Down Political Action Committee have been running ads pushing a DeSantis run. And DeSantis recently wrapped up a trip to Japan and Israel. Last week, NBC News reported that GOP operatives say DeSantis will launch a presidential exploratory committee next month, with a formal campaign announcement coming shortly afterwards. DeSantis is expected to make another appearance in the Hawkeye State on May 13th. He'll headline an Iowa fundraiser with 4th District Congressman Randy Feenstra. Well, also officially in the race, President Biden, he made his re-election bid official last Tuesday, ending months of speculation.
Let's finish this job. I know we can, because this is the United States of America. There's nothing, simply nothing we cannot do if we do it together.
That's Biden's re-election announcement there. It comes as his approval rating is nearly the lowest of his presidency at 41%. A separate NBC News poll shows 70% of Americans don't think President Biden should run for re-election. That same poll shows 60% of voters also don't think Donald Trump should run for the White House a third time. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.